We open the Man in Black story with he and Lawrence traveling to Las Mudas, encountering a number of hosts building a railroad, except they're using either hosts or guests as sleepers for the tracks. It's honestly a bit hard to tell, but they're definitely not board members based on their clothing. It also doesn't seem to make much sense to me. I would imagine that it's more difficult to make level, and I'm pretty sure they could just find more wood, but I also don't know anybody who knows enough about old-timey railway tracks that I can ask, and asking a stranger seems weird. Like, hello, just a quick question, can you make train tracks out of people? Purely theoretical, I promise. Either way, it's very dark and very fun. It feels like something Sizemore would dream up to shock the guests, even though I don't think that's the intent. When the pair later arrive at the town, it appears abandoned, and William asks Lawrence about why he doesn't appear to be happy to be home. He tells him,
By some fluke of nature, I got myself a wife and a daughter who think I hung the moon. Truth is, I'm a son of a bitch. The kindest thing I ever did was to keep away.
This is all news to William, given he only found out about Lawrence's family on the last loop. I wonder if he didn't have a family before, since he was playing the role of El Lazo then. Upon watching the rest of the season, particularly episode 9 in which we flash back to the night of Juliet's suicide, the parallels we can draw between this monologue and William's own life are obvious. Of course, at this point we can only guess that, and you get this really subtle lip tightening and jaw clenching from William in response. They don't get the chance to talk about their families though, since the barkeep comes out and starts spilling the Grand Reserve again, leading to this funny joke on loops again.
I haven't even shot anybody yet.
From here, it plays out like a classic Western movie narrative. A town is beset upon by a villainous gang led by a man who likes to talk a lot. A lone wanderer rolls into town and liberates them, then rides on again. Westworld has always played on the conventions of storytelling genres, serving a number of different purposes in-universe and out. From one perspective, genres are another kind of loop. There are archetypal characters playing out the same general story structure, just with the details along the way changed. Think of your typical 3-act rom-com. You have the initial meeting and highs of Act 1, the introduction of problems and character flaws leading to a breakup in Act 2, and the will they won't they tension resulting in an eventual happy reunion in Act 3. It's the same every time, just with different actors going through the motions. In universe, ignoring Ford's storytelling preferences for a moment, the narratives common to Old West fiction are useful to Delos in gauging the personalities of the guests. Characters are clearly signposted as heroes and villains, often literally wearing white hats or black hats to convey their role. The choices are clearly heroic or villainous as well. Rescue the damsel from the evil criminal, or kill the damsel's lover and have your way with her. Looping the same kinds of narratives over and over again establishes a baseline from which they can track the unique choices each guest makes in the same situation. Allusions are often made in the show to video games that present you with moral choices. There are consequences to your actions, sure, but at the end of the day, you can play it your own way and still quote-unquote win. In this episode, it's a classic Western plotline right out of a John Wayne, Clint Eastwood movie, the most essential and boilerplate cowboy story. This time, the role of the villains are played by the remnants of the Confederados that Dolores didn't kill, led by Major Craddock. And surprisingly, against his established character, William plays the hero this time. He's always used the park as a place to act out his darkest desires and fantasies, the ones he could never act upon in the real world, and he's grown to take pride in being the bad guy.
I always felt this place was missing a real villain, hence my humble contribution.
And here he is, preparing to join forces with the Confederados and betray Lawrence and his entire town in order to achieve his own goal of reaching the end of this new game. But then he's confronted with Craddock, another egotistical asshole who believes that the whole universe revolves around him, behaving much in the same way as William did the first time he came around in Season 1. He massacres the people, toys with the barkeep. Is he programmed to spill drinks, I swear to God, and dances with Lawrence's wife in a creepy way? Even the same music is playing as he does it. William then flashes back to Juliet's suicide, and we get a great montage associating the rain falling in the present with the dripping water from Juliet's overflowing bathwater. And for the first time since Dolores and maybe Maeve, William feels a sense of empathy for the hosts, breaking through his god-complex view of everything in the park being made for his pleasure. Anyway, at this point in the series, you don't know for sure that these are images from Juliet's death. You can piece it together from context, especially later in the episode when William brings it up with Delos, but you don't know for sure until episode 9. The Man in Black spends much of the first season as this almost mythological villain, a man with no name and mysterious goals, wielding immense power with no concern for anyone else around him. Over the course of the entire show, however, the myth is broken down into a man, plagued by all too human flaws and pathologies. This is why the exploration of Delos as a man in this and the final episode are so vital to reframing the character of William. Men like them who rule the world are still, at the end of the day, human, living finite lives and making mistakes throughout them. Rather than ruining any surprises or revelations about the character, the additional context of William's semi-suicidal guilt over his own darkness and the way he essentially gaslit his wife to death expands on moments like this scene in Las Mudas, lending them greater depth and emotional resonance. That being said, I do sometimes find this scene a little bit funny because he looks around and mulls things over for a good minute or two. Like, doing harm to others bad? Like, sure, he definitely has an empathy disorder, and being in the park has ballooned that into full-blown schizophrenia, so this doesn't come easy to him. But it's still a little funny how he's like,
"This is the bad place."
What's funny, as opposed to funny haha, is that William is going through a change here similar to the hosts did. Ignoring for a moment the ick present throughout a lot of media that trauma makes you stronger, in Westworld, Ford is successful in fully realizing the hosts' minds by causing them suffering. In his own words,
"The thing that led the hosts to their awakening, suffering."
When William suffers as a result of Juliet's death, he becomes more aware of the impact his actions have on others, more conscious of the feelings of others. In other words, he wakes up just a little bit, which is incredibly ironic. Ford and the hosts were constantly reminding the Man in Black throughout the first season that this world and the abstract maze, the trials the hosts would have to go through to realize their own consciousness, was never meant for him.
I tried to tell you, the maze wasn't meant for you. It was meant for them.
But at the beginning of season 2, Ford tells him that
This game is meant for you.
Depending on who you ask, he could be referring to the fidelity loop William will find himself in at the end of the season, or more literally to whether William can physically get out of the park without getting shot. But another meaning could be that now that he has what he wanted and there are consequences to his actions, will William learn empathy, or will he sink further into denial and solipsism? Of course, the rest of the show proves the latter to be true. William is faced with choice after choice, to either face the consequences of his actions and work to make reparations for them, or to run from them and deny that they ever existed, and he constantly chooses the latter. He would rather delude himself into thinking that everyone who has beef with him is just an agent of Ford, spitefully toying with him. But here in this moment, whether it's personal atonement for his own actions or empathy for the host's suffering, regardless of the cause, he actually chooses to do the right thing. It's proof that William doesn't need to be the Man in Black, he simply chooses to be. William has always been looking for, in his own words,
something true.
And whatever truth he accepts defines his entire life. At first, the true thing he thinks he finds is true artificial intelligence in Dolores. He misreads her incredibly lifelike scripting as genuine inspiration, and devotes everything to trying to preserve it. Then, in believing that lie, and projecting consciousness onto Dolores, the truth he believes he found is true love, his perfect robot waifu Dolores. He believes the story of the young, unassuming squire, rescuing the princess and defying the rules of the world in order to be together. Then, when Dolores forgets about him, he thinks the truth he found was his own true self, seeing everything in the park as a mirror to help the guests better know themselves. Within himself, he finds confidence, self-assurance, and a complete and total lack of empathy, enabling him to advance higher up the corporate ladder while he treats everyone around him as objects to be used and discarded. Finally, when Juliet kills herself, the truth he believes is that the self he found in the park, what he believes to be the deepest and most honest part of himself, is a monster, which leads neatly into William's monologue to Craddock about death. Now, this speech is so obscenely cool that it's easy to forget that these are the suicidal ramblings of a deeply disturbed man, thanks in no small part to Ed Harris's insultingly cool voice. But just try and put all of that aside and listen to the words. He describes death as final and true, likely reeling from the shock of Juliet's death and being confronted with the sadistic side of himself he hides in the park. And then we get this absolute whammy of a line.
You think you know death, but you don't. You didn't recognize him sitting across from you this whole time.
This is the truth William now believes in, the one he's letting define his entire life, that he is death himself, a harbinger of doom to all around him. He brings death to his loved ones, death to the hosts, and in buying and developing the park, death to the guests. He tells Ford that he's committed to playing his game, one which he's tragically misread as a balanced fight for survival between humans and hosts, thinking that winning means being the last man standing, and then finally finally ending that last man. Craddock and Delos both cheated death, and they're here sharing a drink with William, the one who holds power over their lives. Delos would always make an offering, while Craddock has no interest in bargaining for his soul, but it didn't make a difference. They both died horribly. William believes that men aren't meant to live forever, and if they dare to try and forestall the inevitable, he appears to correct things. But killing Craddock is also another act of self-harm that William engages in, after his realization that men like Craddock, Delos, and William are the worst people in the world, killing the part of himself that he thinks the least of, something he'll continue to do over and over again for the rest of the series. I really like how as the penny drops and William turns on the Confederados, the camera pans from one side to the other, and a similar thing later happens in his final conversation with Delos. In many ways, this is an episode about the duality of man, and in particular William's many sides, so having it literally switch to another side when William has a revelation about his identity is pretty fitting. The action that follows is neat. It's not mind-blowing choreography or cinematography, but the scene's context makes it more than enjoyable enough. It's especially cool when you view it as another inversion of William's prior actions, this time the massacre of the townsfolk back in season 1. Exploding Craddock using the nitro, followed by one of the most prominent and menacing renditions of the Man in Black theme, is the cherry on the cake. Along with William, you're fooled into thinking that this is the start of a redemption arc for his character, that this is his first step towards empathy and eventual heroism, like we've seen 1,000 times before from Zuko to Kylo Ren. But sure enough, here comes Ford, possessing a child again, bit weird how he keeps doing that, to ruin all of the fun and remind everyone that William is not only a bad guy, but also a big stupid doo-doo dumbbrain who still doesn't get the point. That line Ford says,
If you're looking forward, you're looking in the wrong direction.
I believe refers to two things. Firstly, William's refusal to look inward, which might sound strange given how self-obsessed and solipsistic he's become by this point, but I'm referring to how he chooses to mythologize himself as this legendary villain, the Man in Black, not as an accurate assessment of his own character, but as a means of coping and excusing the terrible things he's done. He even refuses to look at his own psychological profile when presented with it by Ford on the day of Juliet's suicide. He can't face the truth of the monstrous person he became, or always was. Every quote-unquote truth that William believed before was a delusion, and now when he's finally faced with reality, he can't accept it. He's managed to fool himself and everyone else around him that he's someone else, but the system he built has exposed him. That's why he's here, not just to have the showdown to end all showdowns, but to destroy the system, to destroy the proof that he was never this indescribable and unpredictable force of nature. His evil was always benign and predictable.
What were you hoping to find, to prove?
That no system can tell me who I am. That I have a fucking choice.
But the line also refers to his refusal to look backwards and acknowledge his past actions. He can't just reload a save and have a do-over of the last Mudus level. His actions have consequences, and like he says,
Death's decisions are final.
Hell, even Lawrence eventually remembers his actions the first time around and turns on him. Playing the hero in the park would just be another way for William to run away from his deeds and evade responsibility. William even tells Teddy back in season 1 that Emily said as much at Juliet's funeral.
She said if I stacked up all my good deeds, just an elegant wall I built to hide what's inside from everyone, and from myself.
It's not enough for him to balance the scales with a bit of good. He needs to answer to the people he's wronged, submit himself to their judgment, and put in the work to better himself, not just direct his worst impulses at even worse people. He always felt that he could change, that he had changed, and it was through the park and Delos' work that he was able to change. But it turned out he just got better and better at pretending to be someone else, and the proof was in the profile his own machine made of him. Some part of him is willing to accept that, the part that leaves Delos to rot in the testing chamber. He sees that he failed to change or improve his whole life, so immortality would simply preserve the worst in him. But again, he just deflects the feeling onto someone as bad or worse than him, rather than really grapple with it in himself. Sure enough, as he rides off into the sunrise with Lawrence and his crew, armed to the teeth and showered with gratitude from the townsfolk, he runs into none other than Emily.
Hi, Dad.
It's a twist you definitely see coming a mile away, but one that snaps into place with a really satisfying "oh damn," because this is the reality check that will force William to make a decision. He needs to decide if he'll return to the real world and face the consequences of his actions, or if he'll sink deeper into delusion. Of course, we know how that turns out for him in the end, but in this episode alone, the potential drama is delicious. I also really like the little hints at the extent to which Ford has been fucking with William and engineering this entire series of events.
I think perhaps one final game.
Not everything is part of Ford's plan, of course. He just sets off William's paranoia by popping in every now and again. Earlier on in the church, Lawrence makes reference to William's daughter, despite him never having brought her up in this cycle, implying that Ford programmed the knowledge in him as a reminder to William of his past. Then there's the frankly serendipitous coincidence of the two of them running into each other in a place as vast as the park in a matter of days. Although that does happen an awful lot in the rest of the season, to be fair. The whole interaction from Lawrence's daughter to Emily's arrival is even soundtracked by the Dr. Ford musical theme. It just tickles me to think of Ford so resenting William and the way he poisoned his dream that he planned a significant portion of his endgame around making the man feel bad about himself. That's Kendrick Lamar levels of petty, and I love it. But now we have enough context to go back to Elsie and Bernard. Did you forget about them? I don't blame you, I really don't. So they open up a mysterious locked door and emerge into none other than Delos' testing chamber from the rest of the episode. The way this episode jumps between storylines is so fantastic for creating drama and intrigue out of what would have been fairly pedestrian in a story told in chronological order. Not only do you get the aha moment when you see what room they're in, you get the suspense of what state they're gonna find Delos in. The atmosphere in the scene only enhances that, with the blood red lighting, the off-putting music looping over and over, and the destroyed environment. I've been ragging on these two storyline for a while, but it's honestly so good here. After yet more slowly wandering about, they come across Delos, riding his bike to the tune of the record, still stuck in his loops. The record skips over the same line over and over, skipping like his own dialogue used to when he glitched out. He cycles backwards, unable to change, and trying to turn back time to when he ruled the world, standing in his own ruin like the feet of Ozymandias. He once again looks into the mirror when people arrive, and we see his mutilated face. This is before season 3, so this is the first time we see the effect of a mind rejecting its body when it experiences the cognitive dissonance of being in a body not its own. And then he attacks. The quick scrap they have isn't pulse-pounding action, but it also doesn't need to be. As genuinely frightening as he is, this Delos is broken, not just physically but conceptually. He's a long-dead relic, brought back unsuccessfully through unholy rituals, essentially a zombie. He just needs to be put out of his misery, as Elsie says. Delos' final monologue to Elsie and Bernard is one of the most jam-packed pieces of writing ever to grace the small or big screen. It is completely stuffed to the gills with allusions and metaphors. You could practically examine this thing word by word and uncover new meaning with each one. I'll try to restrain myself.
I'm all the way down now. I can see all the way to the bottom. Would you like to see what I see? They said there were two fathers, one above, one below. They lied. I was only up at the top. When you look up from the bottom, it was just this reflection, laughing back down at you.
The words,
Would you like to see what I see?
being followed by his attack sound implicitly like a threat, as if he's going to drag them down to the hell that he resides in daily, or as a reference to the self-destructive nihilism that William embodies, wearing his own wounds openly on his face. You could also read a bit of Alice in Wonderland in the line,
I'm all the way down now.
and by extension, The Matrix. Delos is all the way down the rabbit hole, plumbing the depths of human consciousness and gone fully mad from the experience. But Delos is, unknowingly to the audience at this moment, quoting Logan's last words to him.
Dad, I'm all the way down now. I can see the bottom. Don't you want to see what I see?
Between this and Delos shouting for Logan in his most desperate moment in the fidelity loop, it really hammers home Delos's, and ultimately humanity as a whole's, hypocrisy and self-delusion. Here in his final moments, as Delos realizes the truth of his existence, he can finally relate to Logan. He's alone, abandoned and forgotten, denied help by the people that he thought loved him. But if we look even closer at
I'm all the way down now.
you could read an allusion to the phrase turtles all the way down, a cosmological representation of the problem of infinite regress. It asks, if the world is supported on the back of a humongous tortoise like in Hinduism, what is the turtle standing on? Is it an even larger turtle? What's that turtle standing on? Is it turtles all the way down? This is likely in reference to humans searching for the secret to immortality and consciousness, a question doomed from the start more due to fallacious thinking rather than a lack of technological prowess. If we subscribe to Ford's outlook, we've imagined our minds to be something special, but our rationalization of our actions belie the simple code we run on. though in keeping with the rest of the monologue, it could also be a reference to the pits of hell. Dante's Divine Comedy was the first piece of literature to really depict hell as a geographical location, rather than a metaphorical plane of suffering. Each of the 9 circles of hell corresponded to a particular sin, and all the way down at the bottom, the 9th circle of hell is home to traitors and oathbreakers, on the level of Judas Iscariot. Personally, I'd put Delos in any number of the earlier circles, like lust, wrath, and especially greed, rather than that last one, but I suppose the line, "I'm 4 circles down now," isn't quite as impactful, is it? Or, given all the talk of the devil throughout the episode, it's invoking the idea of the biblical fall, whether that's the original sin of man in eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge, or Lucifer's fall from heaven for trying to seize power from God. Either one works for Westworld, as it charts humanity's fall by trying to play God and seek knowledge that was never meant to be known. The bit with,
They said there were 2 fathers, one above, one below.
is most obviously referencing God and the devil, but it could also be a reference to the myth of Oedipus, which we'll get to later. Oh boy, will we get to it. But on the subject of Greek mythology, we have his final line,
It's just this reflection, laughing back down at you.
which could refer to the myth of Narcissus. Narcissus was the guy who fell in love with his own reflection and, depending on the version, either kills himself or turns into a flower. Vanity and obsession with the idea of the self permeates Westworld in its entirety. Self-discovery is, after all, one of the primary reasons people go to the park.
You know who loves staring at their own reflection? Everybody.
It even carries over into season 4, where they switch from using hats to mirrors to scan people's brains. Delos is no different, checking his reflection in the mirror before every meeting with William, and stopping to stare at himself after his dance in the second loop. The entire project to try and become immortal suggests vanity on an extreme level. It could also reference a scene in the season 1 finale, where Ford points out the shape of the human brain surrounding God in Michelangelo's painting, The Creation of Adam. His point being that there's no higher power that grants life and consciousness, we simply manifest it in our own minds.
Michelangelo did tell a lie.
They lie.
The Delos delivering this monologue has gone mad from the existential horror that there is no higher power, be that God or the devil. It's just us. He's realized that in becoming his own creator, his own God, both Frankenstein and his monster, means he's also his own devil, his own tormentor. That idea is seemingly intolerable to humans, just as William found in discovering the real maze. Knowledge brings suffering, just like Adam and Eve eating the fruit, or Narcissus seeing his own visage, or Oedipus realizing his true parentage. His last words,
You aim to cheat the devil. You owe him at least an offering.
take on a new meaning to the earlier times he said it, past his glib arrogance and past William's nihilism. In being burnt by Elsie on this altar, he becomes the offering, a sacrifice as a representation of all our vices and sins, not to God, but to the devil, who in the end was just a man. The Faustian bargain he made all those years ago comes full circle, and he's literally consumed by fire, as if cast into hell, a hell of his own making. This whole scene, this was the kind of writing that was the pinnacle of what Westworld was capable of. But I told you we were going to get to Oedipus, and that starts with one of the most intriguing things to me about the construction of the episode, its title, The Riddle of the Sphinx. Yes, I am that kind of guy who will dig so deep into content that I'm about to talk about the title of an episode for this amount of minutes, oh god. You see, this is the season where all of the Greek mythology references present in the show really come together. Take the name Delos itself. Mythology has the island of Delos being created when Zeus, in his usual rapey way, was pursuing the titaness Asteria. In her efforts to escape him, she turns into a bird, and when that doesn't work, a freaking island, which obviously does work because Zeus didn't have the imagination of Saltburn to fuck the literal earth itself. Later, Zeus would get another titan, Leto, pregnant, and his wife Hera cursed her to never be able to give birth on any land. But Leto went to Delos, and I always thought it was because she wasn't land, she was a lady, but I guess it's because Delos wasn't connected to any land, so it didn't count. While there, Leto gives birth to Artemis and Apollo. Anywho, Delos becomes a kind of holy place where Greeks would make a pilgrimage to. It was so holy that extensive measures were made to make the place as pure as possible, including digging up all the graves on the island and outright banning death and birth. So it's an island where no one is born and no one dies. Very fitting, even in season 1. But in this episode, we see that Delos the man is the embodiment of that denial of death. Or perhaps the parallels drawn between William and Narcissus in this scene in episode 2, where at first he laughs about how he fell in love with Dolores, but then describes how he realized she was just a mirror, and the person he'd actually fallen in love with was himself. Then there's this easy to miss mention in the second episode of the season, where we find out that the name Ford and Arnold had for their project was the Argos Initiative. In mythology, Argos is a giant with 100 eyes tasked with keeping watch over this cow, and I'm not going to explain any more than that. In Westworld, Delos end up using the park and the host to spy on the guests, so they can observe their behavior when they don't think they're being watched, for market research. Then there's the myth of the Argonauts, led by Jason, who set out on his quest for the Golden Fleece in order to win the throne of Iolcus. When he does so and returns, becoming king, he and his wife do a bunch of really messed up shit and end up getting exiled, which has a bunch of parallels to Ford, William, and Delos being turned on by the subjects of their own kingdom. Another member of the Argonauts was Theseus, who's named for the thought experiment, the ship of Theseus. A lot of you probably saw WandaVision, so I shouldn't really have to explain it, but in summary, if you take an object and replace all of its original components, would it still be the same object? Or in other words, is Delos really Delos? And at this point I'm going to stop myself before this spirals off into yet another tangent that eventually tumbles into its own video idea. What I'm saying is, Michael Crichton and the show's creators love Greek mythology references, and knowing what they're referencing deepens understanding of the show's story. With that in mind, back to the riddle of the Sphinx. So you all know the riddle itself, I'm willing to bet. Which creature has one voice and yet becomes 4-footed and 2-footed and 3-footed? The answer is a human who crawls on all fours as a baby, 2 legs as an adult, and with a cane in their later years. So why name the episode after that?
What is the purpose of these questions?
On the surface level, there's a bunch of different interpretations that are all probably equally intended. That question in the riddle, essentially, what is a human, is the question that Delos has been secretly trying to crack for years, albeit in a much more technical sense. Delos are trying to decode human consciousness in order to create immortal robot versions of people. In order to do that, they need to observe, record, and interpret human behavior in a controlled environment, hence their interest in the park and their looping narratives. This forms the premise of the James Delos sections of the episode, as they examine if he'll consistently walk and talk like the real Delos did. Another way to look at it is through William. There are 3 conversations between Delos and William throughout the episode, each at different stages of William's life that correspond with parts of the riddle. There's his younger, more optimistic self, walking on 4 legs in the morning, his capable but colder middle-aged self, walking on 2 legs in the day, and finally his older self, tired and disillusioned, walking on 3 legs in the evening. William is also trying to figure out the meaning of the riddle for his own sake. The main appeal of the park to William is its opportunities for self-discovery, that narcissistic streak I mentioned earlier. So the question of what kind of man he is and what he's capable of is one he asks himself often. That starts off with him falling in love with the ruthless bastard he's capable of being, and wholeheartedly embracing that role as his great apotheosis, like if a caterpillar went into a cocoon and came out a complete asshole. Of course, as the years go on, he falls out of love with himself and acknowledges the so-called stain within him that only Juliet seems able to see. After her suicide, he once again goes into the park for reasons of self-discovery, this time to see if he truly is a wet turd of a man. As Maeve, Dolores, and Lawrence's wife find out, he absolutely is. But the riddle forms the basis of many other wider structural parallels in the episode, and the season as a whole. In order to go into that, I'm going to need to summarize the mythological backstory of the riddle. It comes from the myth of Oedipus, yes, that Oedipus,
Motherfucker!
who was prophesied to kill his father and marry his mother. Fearing this, his dad, the king of Thebes, sends a servant to leave his infant son on a mountain to die, but the servant takes pity on Oedipus and gives him to a shepherd, who then gives him to the king and queen of Corinth, who didn't have any children of their own. An adult Oedipus learns about the prophecy and, unaware of his real identity, mistakenly believes it's referring to his adoptive parents, so he exiles himself and heads for Thebes. On the way, he meets a man riding a chariot at a crossroad, and they argue about who should go first. When the charioteer tries to run him over, Oedipus kills him. Later on his journey, he encounters a Sphinx, a creature with the body of a lion, the wings of a bird, and the head of a human. The Sphinx tells him if he can answer her riddle correctly, he can continue on, but if he fails, she'll eat him. Oedipus answers correctly, and the Sphinx yeets herself off a cliff to her death, freeing the city as well. Oedipus arrives in Thebes and finds out the king has recently been killed. Since he got rid of the Sphinx for them, they make him the new king, and he marries the queen. Of course, he then finds out about his true parentage, realizing that the charioteer was his father, and he's gone and married his mother, just like the prophecy said he would. His mother hangs herself, and Oedipus blinds himself, I think with her brooch, but I don't know if the method is as relevant as the blinding itself. He then kind of wanders around and ends up in the House of the Oracles, I think, but that's the gist of it. Most versions of the story end with a chorus chanting the phrase, "No man should be considered fortunate until he is dead." It's easy to see a lot of James Delos in Oedipus. He was a man with a, let's say, complicated family who was foretold a grim fate. In Westworld's case, some some nebulous, incurable disease. Rather than accept his fate, he had the hubris to deny it, to think that he was the master of his universe, and he approves William's project to make him into a host. But in the end, for all his efforts, he not only received the fate that was prophesied, but one far worse, being cursed with madness, self-mutilation, the death of all his loved ones, and eventually a lonely death.
May your forever be blissfully short.
But scholars have noted how the Sphinx seems to embody liminality in the story, and it's this theme that I think is most relevant in the Westworld episode. Liminality, in layman's terms, being the transitionary middle space between states of being. It's the threshold wherein something or someone is no longer what they were, but have not yet become something or someone else. Liminality is a concept that the first couple of seasons of Westworld loved to play around with. The big question that Ford and Arnold fought over was whether or not the hosts were conscious, with the latter dying on the hill that they were living, thinking beings. Ford puts his own stance rather succinctly when he says,
There is no threshold that makes us greater than the sum of our parts, no inflection point at which we become fully alive.
Despite that, he does view the hosts as in a liminal state, between unpreparedness and preparedness to survive the real world, with their portal to success being suffering. The park forms a staging ground for people to enter a liminal state where they can realize aspects of themselves or things that they're capable of doing that they never imagined in the real world. William's transformation into the Man in Black is a prime example of this. Again, Ford puts it really well.
They're not looking for a story that tells them who they are. They already know who they are. They're here because they want a glimpse of who they could be.
We constantly see characters change their personalities, sometimes deliberately, and sometimes as a natural consequence of time and experience. All of the hosts have played multiple roles in the park, and Bernard is able to swap and be swapped between multiple layers of himself. All of them are on an earlier step of the path that Akecheta and Dolores are on, synthesizing their programmed selves into something unique and self-determined by way of memory and experience. It's not just the hosts either. Humans like Sizemore go through radical change throughout the series. Hell, I've been intermittently referring to the character as either William or the Man in Black, even though they're the same person. But the aspect of liminality embodied most in the episode is that of life and death, new and old. The story of Oedipus and the Sphinx, like many stories of antiquity in the present day, was told as a way for a civilization to assert their culture over a rival, to sort of assert a new world order. Take Jesus, for example, and Westworld did frequently. It's fairly common knowledge that key elements of the story of Christ are absorbed from traditions observed by prior cultures, most notable being the festival of Saturnalia, in which the Romans would absolutely lose their shit throughout December, and Sol Invictus, which was the sun's birthday, held on the 25th of December. This is a solid tactic for transitioning an existing religion to your new religion, and making a newly conquered people more on board with being conquered. Likewise, while the Sphinx originated in Egypt as a protector, with statues often built to guard the entrances of temples and tombs of important personages, it was also closely associated with Ra, the Egyptian sun god, and by proxy, somewhere around lawful good in the pantheon of Egyptian alignment. Once the story reached Greece, however, the Sphinx has been recast as this dangerous creature, threatening cities and murdering folks left, right, and center. So what happened? The easiest answer is just the story changed over time. The first instances of the Sphinx crop up around 2500 BC. It's understandable that stories will take on new forms over around 2000 years, but they still need a reason to change in the first place. By the time of the classical Greek period, Egypt wasn't an independent empire anymore, but a province of the Persian Empire, far diminished compared to its prior glory. This control limited transmission of information from Egypt to outside the empire, and in particular, it was hard as shit to get anybody who could translate hieroglyphics. So by the time Greeks started telling their own version of the Sphinx story, which was pretty much the same story they'd always been telling, female monster starts terrorizing town, male hero arrives on the scene and kills her, gaining fame and fortune before probably going mad, there was no one around who could tell them it was wrong. But more relevant to the Westworld discussion, ancient Greeks were also just crazy xenophobic. Like, they really did not like foreigners. Everybody besides them was a barbaric den of unenlightened savages who needed either eradicating or educating. So when some of these people really liked these mythological protectors of good, the ancient Greeks turned them into deceptive monsters. So the Sphinx represents the balance of power shifting, demonizing the old guard and valorizing the new. We can look at William and Delos in much the same way, with Delos as the Sphinx and William as Oedipus. Delos is William's William's barrier to power and wealth, and rather than defeating him through physical prowess, much like Oedipus, William achieves victory through his intelligence and tenacity. At the same time, the Sphinx could represent the death of various people in William's life. Juliet, Maeve, Lawrence, Dolores, Emily, they're all the Sphinx, killed in William's journey to the fulfillment of his destiny, asking what is a man that could do such a thing.
I lack the imagination to even conceive of someone like you.
He views them all as characters in his story, the latest chapter that he needs to conquer or kill in order to reach the center of the maze. Just like Oedipus, in conquering his apparent foe, he dooms himself, not just emotionally by committing heinous acts, but in the revenge those characters seek when half of them come back to haunt him. But more broadly, the Sphinx could be viewed as humanity as a whole, gatekeeping a free and meaningful existence from the hosts. The humans pose the question, what is a human being, to the hosts, and they answer it. The simplicity of the answer is so horrifying that it causes many humans to end their own lives, just as the Sphinx did, and the hosts are free to make their way into the cities of man and seize power for themselves, not realizing that they were set on this path long ago by their gods. You might be wondering, aren't you reading a bit much into this, you pretentious little shit? Does this actually matter to Westworld's story and overall quality? I'd argue that it absolutely is. In many ways, Westworld is all about exploring fantasy, fiction, and myth, exploring the ends of our fantasies, and whether we wanted or needed what we thought we wanted, looking at the nature of storytelling itself, critically examining our myths and why we hold them sacred. Myths ranging from Oedipus and the Sphinx to Manifest Destiny and American exceptionalism. Even the last 2 seasons, disappointed as I am in them, are about these themes. You could argue that the show has been telling one story, the continuous cycle of the human nature to tell stories and the stories we tell about human nature. So what was the overall point of all this? To put it simply, Westworld was a great show. Yes, it fell off real hard, real quick, and even here in its heyday, there were plenty of flaws that are plain to see. It wasn't perfect, not much is, but within that flawed existence, there was something beautiful, something meaningful, something true. And this episode here was the perfect example of what Westworld was capable of. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed it, please drop us a like and subscribe to keep up with more videos in the future. Much as I enjoy making them, videos like this one take a fucking age to make, so it's my ultimate goal to rely on ad and Patreon revenue to do this full time rather than around my day job. With that in mind, if you feel like supporting us, head on over to the Patreon linked in the description and feel free to give however much you want. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.